All right, I am asked to open up, but first, so I'm Professor Anthony Clark, and I'm the professor of a course on the history of Christianity in China. I am here with three marvelous students, but I am not ready for us to begin yet. But we are also here with a whole class of students who have customarily begun by encouraging us with a round of applause, just to keep us going. So, excellent, excellent. All right. Well, I want to just say a couple of things before we start, and then and we'll introduce ourselves. But even before that, let me just say this: not all of us here speak Chinese, and so what that means is that there are some terms and some names, like Hongxiuquan, which is not exactly a comfortable name on the non-indoctrinated tongue. There are other. What's the son's name? Hongtianguifu. That just rolls. Actually, that's a lovely sounding name.
It's beautiful.
Hongtianguifu. That's a beautiful name, but it doesn't exactly roll off the English-speaking tongue. So just know that in advance. But let me start with one little quote. They don't expect this, but the quote is this, because we were talking, at least Belle and I were chatting beforehand about the military aspect of the Taiping group, and we're talking about the Taipings, and you'll take the floor in a second. But women served in the military, and it's not an unusual thing that women served in the military. There's a famous Yang family of women who were known to be such great military strategists that there was actually an opera made after the Yang family women. But here's a passage by someone, I think it was named Tian Wang, and here is the passage. In the Taiping army, there was a woman by the name of Xiao Sanyang, known as the, quote, woman commander. Some said that she was Chao Gui's younger sister. She was at least 20, tall and long-armed, a great general on horseback. She could shoot an arrow with either hand. When the Taiping army captured Chengjiang, she led several hundred women soldiers and climbed the city wall, braver and fiercer than all the men. So here is something very unique about the Taipings, but that's all I wanted to say. We'll introduce ourselves. I'm sitting here with three students. That's my cue.
Hello, my name is Ella Shanefelder. I am a history student at Whitworth University that also studies international studies.
I'm Julia Shanefelder. I am also at Whitworth University and I study graphic design.
And I am Belle Knutson, a senior history major, and I'm going to start us off with an introduction to the Taiping Rebellion. It was brutal and contradictory and caused at least 20 million deaths. Hong Xiuquan, the leader of the rebellion, was born in Guangzhou province in 1814. He was a very bright scholar, and his small town supported him in taking the civil service examinations to hopefully bring wealth to his family. After failing the exams 3 times, he went into a trance-like state where he had visions of 2 men. Hong returned to his village and continued teaching as a schoolmaster because he did not quite yet understand the gravity these visions would have on his life. He took the exam 1 more time and failed yet again. It is important to note that less than 1% of people pass the civil service examinations. One day, when he was in his home relaxing, he spotted a Christian pamphlet written by Liang Fa, given to him after one of his examinations. He quickly had a rush of visions come back, and he concluded it was God and Jesus who he saw. Hong then told everyone he knew about Christianity and his belief to be God's second son, the younger brother to Jesus Christ. He was fired from his teaching position in 1844 for saying Confucius was a false god. Hong then developed a small group of followers calling themselves Baishangdi Hui, or God worshippers. Hong traveled and gained followers including Western Christian preachers, peasants, merchants, and warlords. His group believed in the abolition of private property and the termination of the social class system. Mao Zedong, the later communist ruler of China, modeled many ideals after Hong, like the abolition of private property and communal farming. By January 11, 1851, Hong had gained power and a larger group of followers and changed their name to the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom. They conquered Nanjing and it became their capital. The group killed millions and ransacked cities hoping to take over China. The ruling Qing Empire was busy dealing with the Opium Wars with Britain and struggled fighting the rebellion. In 1861, the rebellion attempted to take the Qing capital Beijing and failed. Many attempts continued, but this marked the end of the expansion of the rebellion, which was ultimately defeated in 1864. And next, we're going to go off to our first question to Ella, and it is, why was Hong God's Chinese son?
Well, thank you for the introduction, Belle. That was very good. The first thing about the phrase God's Chinese son is that it is a title for Hong Xiuquan that encompasses his identity, beliefs, and character. He was born as a Hakka man in the rural Hua County north of Canton, but he was also influenced by a collecting mix of Confucian scholarship and Western Christianity. So his life could be considered a turbulent clash of cultures, and this title specifically, with both God and Chinese, he can't have one identity without the other, which also leads into a lot of his beliefs contradicting each other and being hypocritical, but that's the only way that he could have lived with such conflicting identities. But as for his bringing up, the lifestyle Hong pursued before his days as the heavenly king was one that represented the model Chinese man. He was a married Confucian scholar and a genius teacher who was determined to pass the civil service exam to serve in China's bureaucracy. His occupation was also a demonstration of filial piety because even though he grew up in a farmer's family, a lot of his bloodline that had the Hong last name were known to be scholars in the bureaucracy. So he was serving in generational footsteps to want to become a scholar in the imperial bureaucracy. But with his village in Guanglubu, which was a rural Hakka village, he celebrated Han festivals and practiced their own Hakka shamanic folk religions, which missionaries and even Hong himself would eventually deem devil worship. But his culturally Chinese lifestyle fractured after taking his third civil service exam in 1837, where he failed and fell into a series of feverish visions in which he saw a full-fledged conceptualization of a golden-bearded man who claimed to be his father and an encouraging brother who urged him to expel demons from the land of China and bring an era of peace. One thing that's really important about this dream is that these demons that he was supposed to expel, he wasn't really told what they were. Within the dream, he was defeating the Buddhist king of the underworld, Yan Luo, or King Yama, as many people know him. But when he actually came to, he didn't really interpret this as anybody specific first. In his first times where he's interpreting this to try to get people to convert to Christianity, most of the time he's considering this Buddhism or Buddhist and Confucius and sometimes Taoist, anyone who would be in the three teachings, because it was kind of a form of idolatry for him, especially Confucianism. Now, this was mostly spurred by Liang Fa, who was also kind of anti-Confucius because he considered that taking the civil service exams was a waste of time due to the discouraging low pass rates. So he could sympathize with Hong Xiuquan a lot. But what he did after he found out that this wasn't as successful to rally the people, he solidified the demons as the Manchurian leaders of China and to unify the common people against the rebellion against the Qing. So it seems that at first he has a more religious approach to this, but as he realizes that the aspect of going against the Qing can give him power, this is where he kind of shifts his belief system, and that's what most people start to follow. But there's also a lot more hypocrisy in his beliefs and tendencies that come later. One of the biggest ones is his denouncements of the emperors. Now, because he's Christian, he goes against a lot of the idolatry that was considered the worship of emperors. So in China, especially since the Shang dynasty, you would worship emperors as your ancestors, and they were often used in divination in the Shang dynasty and were considered god figures. So this, of course, went against the god figure in Christianity. So he denounced emperors of the old times, or kings, which were used with the term Wang. And this was a very grand term, and it usually, the character is used to depict the people, the earth, and the heavens, and the middle thing that would enlighten them or connect them in the character was the emperor or king himself. Now, instead of allowing this to be part of ancient history, Hong Xiuquan took the name Wang for himself and people like Yang Xiuqing and Xiao Chaogui, who were his closest commanders, and he called the old emperors Kuang, which is the king character attached with the dog radical, and dog is an extremely cruel insult in Chinese, so he's very much denouncing emperors. And then but on the other hand, he also elevated some emperors, such as Liu Beng and Zhu Yuanzheng, the Han and Ming first emperors, and because they had similar backgrounds to him. They had modest backgrounds and overthrew tyrannical leaders. So you have sort of this dichotomy between elevating leaders of the past and also denouncing them for idolatry reasons. Now, this wasn't the only time that this happened. There was also times where he denounced Buddhism, as with his dream with Yen Luo, but he also had Guanyin in the Taiping version of the Bible, who is the Buddhist bodhisattva of mercy. And that was one of the things that also clashed with the idea of Western Christianity, which was very monotheistic, but it's including another god of Buddhism into this. So he kind of forms his own identity of Christianity, which very much clashes with the Western version. So overall, one of the most important takeaways of God's Chinese Son is that Hong Xiuquan was unable to separate his identities one from the other. He involved himself in Christianity, of course, but he also included many Chinese aspects that his interpretation of Christianity would be incomplete without.
So I want to add to this something that you conjure without underlining, I think, enough, and that is, so what is the ethnic identity of Hong Xiuquan?
He's a Hakka man.
So in Chinese, it's Kejia, the guest people. So they're
Yeah.
a minority group. Their women don't bind their feet. They're mostly farming people. He's educated, but he's educated in a Chinese way, right? So he's this ethnic minority. And what's the majority of people living in China?
The Han.
The Han people, right?
96%, right?
So he's Kejia or Hakka, you have the Chinese. He becomes Christian, identifies as Christian, which is a Western faith tradition. And then he wants to expel what nationality?
The Manchurians.
Right. So let's think about this. That's 4 different categories. Or is that more than that? Han, Hakka, Manchu, Christian. 4 different categories. And he's mixing and matching things. When we think about identities in the 21st century, we used to say in the academic world, what is your identity? But now we no longer say that. We talk about our identities because we really are, each of us has a pluralistic notion of who we are, right? So I like that you point that out, and it's a really good point. Let's go, Julia, are you next?
Yes.
Okay.
So Julia's question is, how did the Taiping Rebellion affect the common people?
I do want to say that I was inspired actually by one of Dr. Clark's interviews for this question, specifically the one with Nicholas Standard, because he looks to the idea of the margins, which was coined by Edward Said in his Orientalism. And it's the idea of not necessarily viewing just the big figures in history, the named figures, but it's the margins. It's the people who are not named as much, and it's the cultural interactions that don't necessarily have a name, like said before, and also the space between cultures and crossing that. And since we're talking about a rebellion that is about cross-cultural interaction and where 20 million people died, at least, it's important to talk about the margins. So this kind of begins with Hong Xiuquan's beginnings as a Hakka man, like we were just saying. It is a minority ethnic group, and many of them were seen as poor. So he exploited this a lot because many of the Hakka people had to latch on to something because they were in economic squalor, mostly stemmed from the Opium Wars, because the Hakka people are a boating people. That's why the women don't bind their feet, like Dr. Clark said. So the major port was moved to Canton, where mostly Han people lived, so Hakka had less access to the markets. And most of them were left without work because of this. And then he also, the mines were closed in where the Hakka people live for similar reasons. So he also took miners as well into his party. And with this economic inequality and persecution of minorities under the Manchus, the Hakka people were especially susceptible to Hong Xiuquan's anti-Qing views. Even if one didn't actively seek out converting religions, his preaching of stability was extremely attractive. Alongside of poverty, most of the Hakka people, a majority of the Hakka people, were left destitute due to conflict with the Punti people, which was another minority ethnic group. So they truly needed shelter, which was why they went into the arms of Hong Xiuquan's God-worshipping society. But they were not the only common people seeking refuge. The beginning of the Taiping Rebellion coincided with the warlord era, which means there were many bandits running around China, especially with the growth of sieges due to the Taiping Rebellion. This is briefly touched on in a novel. It's more of a memoir, The World of a Tiny Insect, and it recounts a boy explaining his fears while fleeing from his home during the Taiping Rebellion. And in this memory, he talks about how wary he is of bandits while traveling. And this is a fear shared by many people in China during the time. So Hong Xiuquan takes this fear and he correlates with bandits and merchants, and he gives them, if they join the god-worshipping society, he gives them secret codes for merchants to use if they were stopped by bandits to protect them from being robbed. And he continues to focus this effort on the average person, people who are living in fear due to the upheaval of politics. And many people in the rural county were illiterate. Some of his closest subordinates were illiterate, like Yang Xiuqing and Xiao Chaogui. They were both starting illiterate. So he focused a lot on this, especially due to his dislike for the civil service exams. So few were trained in classical literature that it was, again, very difficult to pass this. So Hong sought to abolish it, which would allow illiterate people social mobility. So this was very attractive to them. So Hong Xiuquan also did start to focus his efforts on literacy by taking over the press. Specifically, he did this by putting the royal seal of approbation on his publishings, which caused publishings under the Manchu is to appear fraudulent without the seal. So it elevated his own writings while making the Manchurian documents seem fraudulent. And he pushed his own values and viewpoints of the Manchurian rulers being demons, since this era was a period in which counterfeit readings were very difficult to distinguish. So most people ended up believing Hong Xiuquan's publishings rather than the Manchu's publishings. And these publishings themselves did not just talk about the Manchurians being demons, but they also preached in the form of manifestos on social concerns that draw on Hong Xiuquan's beliefs. For example, Yang and Xiao, who we were talking about before, were some of Hong's closest subordinates, and explained that humiliation at the hands of the Manchus is the same level as sexual subservience, by equating anyone under their rule to the Chinese who have been taken as concubines for the Manchurians.
I would also like to add that one thing that made Yang Xiuqing and Xiao Chaogui's voices so important to the Taiping Rebellion is that Hong Xiuquan considered them respectively the voices of God and Jesus. They were a mouthpiece for him in his eyes. So when this was promoted to his followers, they were all the more likely to believe their writings and publishings.
Which is interesting, right? Because if Hong Xiuquan is the younger brother of Jesus, then the mouthpiece of the God the Father and of Jesus then hierarchically places them above Hong himself, which is a fascinating political play. I'm going to interject an interesting question here, and then Belle, what is the question you're dealing with, Belle?
The warfare strategies.
Right. So we talked about that right off the bat, didn't we? About the women climbing walls and shooting arrows with both hands. Now, one question I have for both of you, right? So, especially Julia, you're commenting on. You comment on a lot of things, right? So let me ask you a question. Is religion part of the Taiping Rebellion?
I would say yes and no. So it's yes, because he seems to believe in Christianity. He draws a lot from the Bible, but he does alter these beliefs to empower himself.
Okay, so does economics fit into the Taiping Rebellion?
Yes, because he takes people out of economic squalor and exploits that as well.
And does politics fit in to the Taiping Rebellion?
Yes, because he's trying to overthrow a commanding group of the Qing dynasty.
How about racism?
Yeah, because the Manchurian is an ethnic group, and he is also himself an ethnic group that we were saying was pushed out by a lot of people.
So what this does then, when you have this multiplicity of issues, politics, religion, economics, what that does is it allows a hermeneutical, right, an interpretive segue into all sorts of different ways of thinking, right? So people who are interested in theology and religion, do they have a stake in studying the Taiping Rebellion?
I think everyone has a stake in studying the Taiping Rebellion.
So then I'm thinking ahead here, right, because we haven't said this and we have to say this. Who is it after 1949 who's going to latch on to the Taipings as an example of their particular view?
Mao Zedong will.
Yes.
He takes so many of Hong's ideas and just brings them to his own to exploit people, similar to how Hong exploited his own people.
So Mao then turns Hong into a paradigm of Marxist revolution, right? He kind of makes it an economic issue, largely, or a class issue, right? So here we go. Economics, politics, class, race. I find it really quite astonishing that the Taiping rebellion becomes adopted by so many different factions of intellectual interest.
Yeah.
Okay.
Can I add a quick
Yeah.
about specifically Mao Zedong? You can see so much of his influence just based on the policies that Hong Xiuquan used to convert. So like the sharing of food and having everybody have an equal amount, communism right there, and especially his employment of everyone. So you can see women who were working, miners, even pirates he employed, and you could see that pirates also had very feminist tendencies, more equality with Zhang Yisao during the time period. So you can just see how Mao Zedong took his idea of everybody works in order to get to this point. So
Right.
that's just what I wanted to add.
Gosh, I remember my first time living in China was during the era of Deng Xiaoping, and there was in this place Wangfujing, this certain neighborhood with the very first McDonald's, by the way, in China was at Wangfujing, and I remember going there, and it's the first time I learned how to sing Happy Birthday in Chinese. But the thing is just down the street from that McDonald's is the so-called Beijing Foreign Language Press, and the bookstore. And what was featured, lo and behold, but cartoons about Hong Xiuquan and the Taipings, and they're represented as communist revolutionaries.
Wow.
So you can actually get these Taiping rebellion where Hong Xiuquan is this great revolutionary, a la Mao Zedong. Okay, Belle.
All right. Well, I really want to touch on what the differences were, because the Taiping Rebellion is such a dichotomic place. And for example, in the city of Bao, Taiping bandits tried for months to get into the walls of the city but failed. And with each failed attempt, the bandits would strike down a small village near Bao as revenge, killing every resident without offering for them to even join the rebellion. And the bandits eventually managed to cut off the city's water supply and got inside the walls. And without asking for them if they wanted to join the rebellion, they just killed everyone, and they wrapped their houses in bamboo mats and set them ablaze. So this is a very extreme example of Taiping violence, which, as we've said before, eventually killed at least 20 million people. And but a different case was the city of Jiangnan, and they governed this under the land system of the Heavenly Dynasty. And theoretically, there were Taiping overlords in their palaces, and the Jiangguan, made up of local people who operated the money and supplies for the war effort. They also did boat registration, licenses, road passes, water conservancy, litigation, refugee placement, and any other government function required. Poor people in need of jobs quickly flocked to become part of this government and were paid well by the Taiping. And this kind of gives that dichotomy that some cities were treated differently, and this often had to do with location, whether it was close to Hong's hometown or whether it was more Manchurian, Han Chinese as well. They were all treated very differently. And the people who are illiterate could also hold these government positions. Like we said, Hong's two best friends were people in power. Another aspect, as mentioned earlier, the Hakka people used boats, and that is one of the main ways that the rebellion was able to get as far north as they did. They eventually reached 18 different provinces in China, and they used the Yellow and Yangtze rivers to transport. They would hire men to walk along the riverside and pull boats. And another aspect they used were out-of-work miners, and these miners would set explosives on the walls of cities. But the way the Han Chinese and Manchurians fought against this was by using blind men to go and walk around the walls because of their heightened sense of hearing, that they could hear them drilling the explosives into the walls. and I just think that is insane. But
I've never heard
it's-
that actually.
That
That's
was
something
Yes.
else.
the Battle of Changsha.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
I hadn't heard that detail.
I love that detail.
Right.
It's like using people to their best of their abilities. Another aspect I wanted to talk about when it came to warfare was the part the West played in the Taiping Rebellion. Is the United States and Britain are both Chinese or are both Christian societies, and the United States was very eager to help the Taiping, but because Britain had such a control over China at the time from the Opium Wars, the United States chose to look to Britain instead of the Taipings, and Britain was not backing the Taiping. And these reasons were because the Taiping were a complete blasphemy of the Holy Trinity. It's always been the Holy Spirit, Christ, and Jesus. And now,
God the Father. So Christ and Jesus are the same.
Oh, my bad.
No, you're good. We
Yes.
just want to keep you from committing heresy.
Well, Hong wanted to put himself into that mix and make it a holy quadruplet,
Mm-hmm.
which was not at all accepted by any Western Christian standard. And so the United States did not help out the Taiping, and the British, interestingly enough, didn't help out the Taiping, but they also did not help out the Qing. The British sat there and just did nothing. If they needed to pay the Taiping for use of a waterway, they would pay the Taiping, or they would pay the Qing. They sat there as a third party. And eventually the Taiping Rebellion was defeated in its home capital of Nanjing, but its first major loss was not capturing Beijing. Beijing, backed by the main Qing forces, a combination of the Green Flags and Qing soldiers, repelled the rebellion from within its walls. The rebellion struggled in the northern territories because many soldiers and commanders were unfamiliar with the waterways and terrain. The Qing forces, on the other hand, were very knowledgeable and were able to gain the upper hand in northern China. The rebellion was pushed further and further back by the Qing armies and the newly created gentries under warlords. The Qing did not hold much power because of the devastation of the Second Opium War. Taxes and other territorial duties were performed by the warlords or governors, which also laid armies in the same hands. The Qing gave permission to warlords to fight the rebellion in 1863. The warlords, lacking funds and access to trade routes, became creative. They used farming tools like hoes, rakes, and axes as weapons to fight the rebellion in a strategic ambush method. Protecting their communities with what they had and unique war tactics pushed the remaining Taiping rebels into Nanjing, where it was surrounded and conquered in 1864.
So let me just ask all three of you two quick questions. Belle, mostly Belle. Why would Britain stay neutral in this? Right? What do you think the game was for Britain?
Definitely economic interest. They mainly wanted people to consume British goods, which at this time was opium, and fighting and wars heightened the use of drugs.
Well, that's an interesting take, right? Also, I wonder if it was something about just letting China weaken itself.
Yeah, of course.
Right,
Yeah.
because of course, as China becomes weak, then Britain becomes more of a. It could strong arm China more effectively, right? And then the final thing I want to ask all three of you is: so why did it end?
I will take the start of this. So one of the most important people that was involved in this rebellion is Zheng Guofan, who is a Hunanese man who was known to be the Taiping Slayer. He was a Qing general who, after a 2-year siege led by him at Nanjing, he managed to corner Hongqiu Tren to be trapped in the city. And first of all, you have Hongqiu Tren and you have his son, Hong Tianguifu. So Hongqiu Tren, he was delusional at this point. He pretty much lost his mind, which, I mean, I feel like we could see somewhat from the beginning that this was a possible outcome of this. And he claimed that God would find a way to help them, but when he lost help. He ate weeds on the ground to prove that this is the strength that could be given to us, and he was poisoned by them. So it was an act of accidental death. But after he abdicated his throne to his son Hong Tian-Guifu, it wasn't very long before he was defeated by Zheng Guotren, who finally ended the rebellion.
I would also like to add, during the tail end of the Taiping Rebellion, the Nian uprisings were also happening. So that added a lot more chaos into. They were also against the Qing Empire, but the Taiping soldiers did start to drift over to the Nian uprising as well. So,
Who Zheng Guofan also targeted.
yes. Mm-hmm.
So, 1864, the Taiping Rebellion is over. Not long after that, you have another massive uprising called what?
Nian uprising.
The Nian Uprising. But what happens in 1898?
Boxer.
The Boxer Uprising. The Qing is doomed.
Yep.
Yeah.
It is
Absolutely.
just
Immediately, then you have the Chinese Civil War, and then it's just
Right.
terrible.
The Qing is
Yeah.
doomed. 1911, it's over. Abdication happens in 1912, and then
Japan occupation.
Oh.
and then you have the Japan occupation in the 1930s. What a horrible stream of events that's going to happen. All right, well that was I almost want to say that was fun, but we talked about some pretty horrible things. So that
Yes.
was very nourishing and rich. So let's end there, and let's have our wonderful large class give us a sign of appreciation. Thank you. Awesome. Okay. Julia, Ella, Bell, thank you so much. That was great fun. We are finished.